Madam President, I have I rise to speak in support of the amendment that I plan on submitting. It's Amendment 1173. I know it's my intention to work with the managers of the Iran bill to get this amendment filed and voted on soon. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to talk to this amendment for a little bit. You know, I want to begin by complimenting Senator Corker, Cardin, others who have worked hard on the Iran Nuclear Review Act of 2015. It's a good start to a critically important issue for all of us, for the American people. The amendment that I am proposing, that I'm offering today, will make that bill stronger, will give leverage to our negotiators, and make our country more secure. That's our number one priority, and that's what this amendment will help us do. The simple question this amendment proposes is, should the United States, our government, we, this body, allow sanctions to be lifted on a country that our own State Department has designated a state sponsor of terrorism? It's a simple, straightforward question. And in my view, the answer is also simple. The answer is no. Sanctions should not be lifted on a state sponsor of terrorism, especially one with a track record like Iran. My amendment requires the President of the United States to declare that Iran is no longer a sponsor of state terrorism before lifting sanctions and allowing billions of dollars to flood into that country's economy. It's that simple. We should not allow, facilitate, or encourage billions of dollars to go to a country that sponsors terrorism. Because I fear that we have been inured to the issue of state sponsor of terrorism, what that means, I'd like to focus on that a little bit. Let's first start with the states that are on the list: Yemen, Syria, Sudan, Iran. These countries are all on the list because governments in each state facilitate international terrorism. We're not talking about rogue elements within a country that are killing people within their own borders. We are talking about governments themselves, the bodies in charge of a country, the bodies making and enforcing a country's law, supporting acts of international terrorism, including against our own citizens. Why is Iran on the list? Since its founding in 1979, the leaders of the Islamic Republic of Iran, the government, have been sponsoring terrorism. In fact, our State Department has called Iran the world's most active sponsor of terrorism. Since 1979, Iran has been responsible for taking American hostages, for bombing our and our allies' embassies, and for horrible acts of murder across the globe. And here's the key point, Madam President: it hasn't stopped. According to the State Department, Iran continues to support terrorism, Palestinian terrorist groups, and is actively fostering stability throughout the Middle East right now, today. And just last month, on March 2015, a U.S. federal judge found Iran complicit in the 2000 bombing of the USS Cole, the deadliest attack on a U.S. naval vessel since 1987. So let's talk about Iran's involvement in Iraq. I'm a Marine Corps Reserve officer. In 2005, I was recalled to active duty for a year and a half, serving as a staff officer to the commanding general of U.S. Central Command, John Abizaid. During that time, I deployed to many parts of the CENTCOM area of responsibility. And one of the biggest concerns, perhaps the biggest concern that we saw in Iraq during that time, was the increasing threat to our troops of improvised explosive devices, especially what was referred to as explosively formed projectiles, EFPs, the most deadly and sophisticated IEDs on the battlefield. Almost every time I was in Iraq with General Abizaid, he and his staff were briefed on the details of this threat, showing captured weapon systems, the twisted, charred remains of American military vehicles that had been hit by EFPs. Those EFPs killed more American troops per attack than any other roadside bomb. They blasted through tanks, Humvees, anything they hit. They were deadly. They killed and maimed thousands of our troops. I still remember the courage and trepidation I saw in the eyes of our brave military members who had to face this threat on a daily basis. Even some members of this body, to this day, I deeply distrust the leadership of the regime that was responsible for these EFPs. And Madam President, make no mistake, that country was Iran. That much was confirmed by our intelligence agencies and the State Department. But Iran has never taken responsibility for these deaths, and it hasn't said that it will stop this kind of terrorism. Let me provide an example. In 2007, CENTCOM and intelligence officials provided very detailed briefings on the fact that these EFPs were coming from Iran. At the same time, Iran's UN ambassador wrote an op-ed in the New York Times and said that such charges and evidence were being fabricated by the United States. That was the UN ambassador from Iran, Ambassador Zarif. In that op-ed, he was telling a lie to the American people. Why is that important? He is now the foreign minister of Iran. He is now in charge of negotiating this nuclear deal. He is certainly not a trustworthy man. Madam President, if sanctions are lifted, billions of dollars are going to flow from companies and banks from around the world to the economy and government of Iran. They're going to invest in businesses. They're going to invest in the oil and gas sector. They are going to invest in banks. What will the Iranian leadership likely do with that money? Do we trust them to invest in schools and infrastructure and health clinics so they can provide their citizens better lives? Let's use history as our guide. Everything about that country's leadership, everything about that country's history tells us that that money, billions, are likely to be used to pump up their terror machine around the world and target American citizens. Now, I know what we've heard from the administration. Don't worry, if there's a violation of this agreement, these sanctions will just snap back into place. They'll snap back, no problem, piece of cake. Madam President, after serving on active duty for that time I mentioned, I served as a U.S. Assistant Secretary of State. I helped lead the effort in the Bush administration to economically isolate Iran, to go to our allies and say, you have to divest out of the Iranian oil and gas sector, Iranian financial sector. Madam President, there was no snap here. This was a slog. It took years to get companies to divest. And yet now, this administration is talking about, we'll snap back. No problem. We'll divest in a couple days. It's a fantasy. The administration knows it. They should stop using the term snapback because it's not accurate. It's not accurate. So what is the alternative? The alternative is simple. Before lifting sanctions on Iran, Iran needs to take the steps to get off the list of countries that sponsor terrorism around the world. And these are not insurmountable steps. These would include having a clear record for 6 months. That's it, 6 months. Not decades, not years, 6 months of not sponsoring state terrorism. It would also require Iran to renounce terrorism. Simple. Don't engage in terrorism. Don't try to kill our citizens or the citizens of our allies. Don't send your forces around the world to blow things up. or take hostages, and then we will consider lifting the sanctions. You don't have to be our ally. You don't have to like us. We don't have to like you. You don't have to change even the structure of your government. You just should not target our citizens for murder the way you're doing now as one of the biggest state sponsor of terrorism in the world. Now, Madam President, it's been said that such a requirement, an amendment like this, would be a poison pill, meaning that if this amendment is added to the Corker-Menendez bill, it will somehow signify the death of the bill. Now, I've thought long and hard about that. Do I want to be a member of this body who introduces a poison pill? Am I being unreasonable with this amendment? But what I came to is this. It's our job, the most important job we have in this body, is to do everything we can to keep our citizens safe and to enact good policy. Sometimes that means taking difficult positions, and sometimes it means taking very reasonable positions, even though the political process might seem to make it seem as if this is a complicated and difficult issue. Madam President, this isn't complicated. This isn't difficult. This amendment is a simple amendment. It's not difficult. I want to conclude with the question I began with. Is it good policy for the United States of America to allow or even encourage countries and corporations to do business with a state sponsor of terrorism, particularly one that has a history of targeting and killing our citizens? Is that good policy? I believe the vast majority of the American people, Democrat, Republican, any state in the Union, would say no. That's not good policy. I believe if the question is posed directly to the American people, they wouldn't consider this some kind of poison pill. They might even consider this some kind of vitamin pill, one that will make us stronger. It's a supplement to strengthen our negotiators' position. Right now, there's confusion. It's in the press. The Iranians are saying, we have a deal that lifts sanctions immediately. The president has said, no, that's not necessarily clear. We have to be creative on how this is going to happen. Well, Madam President, this amendment will give the president, will give Secretary Kerry the leverage to solve this critical issue. One that the President and the Secretary of State should use and welcome to strengthen our position in the negotiations, not to view it as some kind of poison pill. Again, it's a simple amendment. Before sanctions are lifted, the President and the State Department need to make sure Iran is off the list of states that sponsor terrorism. Iran can take the simple steps to make that possible, and the world will be a much, much safer place. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. Madam President, I yield the floor.